Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Bob Wicks will share how to maintain a healthy perspective in challenging times. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Ministry Resources and Special Initiatives Manager at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. We also put it on our website, Vimeo, and YouTube. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Psychologist and popular speaker Robert J. Wicks is the author of more than 60 books for individuals and professionals, including the best-selling Riding the Dragon. He speaks internationally about resilience, self-care, and the prevention of secondary stress to audiences from the U.S. Congress to Walter Reed Army Hospital, from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine to Harvard Children's Hospital, and from the Princeton Theological Seminary to the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center in England. Some of Wicks' presentations include speaking at the commemoration of the Boston Marathon bombing at the Boston Public Library, a keynote for the American Medical Directors Association, a course in Beirut, Lebanon for relief workers from Aleppo, Syria, and the psychological debriefing of relief workers evacuated from Rwanda during the genocide in 1994. He also regularly speaks at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. Wicks serves as a professor emeritus at Loyola University, Maryland, and has taught in universities and professional schools of psychology, medicine, nursing, theology, education, and social work. And in 1996, then Pope John Paul II awarded Wicks a papal medal for his service to the Catholic Church. Bob, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's wonderful to be here.
That's wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
Great.
Okay?
Great. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm glad it wasn't any longer. I'm always frightened when the introduction gets too long that they'll end with, and then he died. So let's begin. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then I have like a 1-2 minute close up, and I'll try to stick to the schedule so that you can get out on time. There's a cemetery in the United States that's known for its impressive monuments. And probably the most impressive one is of a military person, a general. And on it, it lists all his battles and his accomplishments. Next to it is a much smaller stone. And it was erected by the husband, for his beloved wife who died at 23 years of age. And there's only one line on the stone. And the line is, everywhere she went, she brought flowers. What we must remember is that love can make a sacrament of all we experience in life. This woman knew that, her husband knew that. And I think we need to learn that if our life is going to be rich and meaningful and compassionate. My work generally is with professional helpers and healers, physicians and nurses, relief workers around the world, priests, nuns, teachers, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, helpers. And what I'd like to do is, in the brief time with you, is take some of those themes that are in Riding the Dragon and also build on those themes, material that's not there. And this is very important, not because I'm saying it, but because today we need to look at resilience, self-care, and maintaining a healthy perspective. When we live a compassionate life, it's really a gift to others. As the Chinese proverb goes, when the water in the harbor rises, the boats rise as well. When you reach out to somebody and see the light dawning in their eyes because of your kindness, it's magic. As a matter of fact, if you're Christian, isn't compassion the heart of your faith? Because we're called to act as Jesus did. In this regard, the question Father Godfrey Diekman once posed is, what difference does it make if the bread and wine turn into the body and blood of Christ if we don't? I think Father is echoing a theme similar to one made by G.K. Chesterton a long time ago when he quipped, just going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in your garage makes you a car. Compassion and caregiving also benefit us. As physician and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer once said, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found how to serve. And that's why you tuned in, because you have that kind of commitment. But even though you know it's true, you also know that it's not easy. What you and I need to recognize, and what I share with caregivers, is the fact that just because you can carry the burden of compassion doesn't mean that it's not heavy. As the Japanese proverb goes, eventually even a gushing spring can dry up. A couple of years ago, as was mentioned in the introduction, I was in Beirut for the Marist brothers, and the goal was to bring caregivers from Aleppo, Syria into Beirut, give them a bit of a rest in Lebanon. And I would speak to them on resilience, self-care, and maintaining a healthy perspective through Arabic interpreters. And when I was there, the person who was running much of the program, a brother, shared something that struck me. And I want to get his words correct. He said that a young volunteer asked him one day, why am I losing the best years of my life? Why am I not like the rest of the girls in the world? Why do I not have the right to live fully my youth? Is this God's will? Why does he not answer our prayers and our pleas? In spite of our trust in him, we do not see the end of the tunnel. The brother then added, what answer can I give her and to many other young persons? I listen to them, I support them, I try to seek to stutter words of trust and faith, and this is not always easy. So, given the state of the world, I bring you both potentially good news and bad news. First, the good news. Obviously, in tuning into this presentation, you're very interested in living a rich and compassionate life. Now, the potentially bad news. You are very interested in living a rich and compassionate life. Swiss psychiatrists put it this way, the brighter the light, the deeper the darkness. Because you're so committed, there's a tendency to deny, intellectualize, and seek to avoid or minimize the impact of your ongoing stresses and the turmoil present in society and even in the church today. Plus, if you're someone with a history of being compassionate or involved in a healing or helping profession, people often expect you to simply ignore or not be affected by the unique stresses that you face. But that kind of an attitude doesn't work. And so let's face it, you cope, I cope. This presentation is meant in some way, like the book Riding the Dragon, to share some ideas about doing it a bit better, because quite simply, you deserve to live a better life. And so let's take some time to take some of those themes. Often, no one sees the sacrifices compassionate individuals like yourself, as well as professional helpers and healers make, and the pressures they experience in the process. I remember walking down the street one day, and I ran into a friend who's a nun and a spiritual guide, and I asked her, I hadn't seen her in a while. I asked her, how are you doing? And how do people often respond? They say, fine, their leg could be falling off. but instead she filled up. And I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, no one has asked me that in a long, long time. I remember a similar experience with myself. I was, having a hard time at work, and it triggered a slide into the basement of my psyche. And as long as I was in the spiritual basement and the darkness, I thought, well, as long as I'm down here, I might as well look around. And I learned a great deal about myself while there. This self-knowledge was to be helpful, not only for me, but in my work with others. And I told a friend about that. He was a Jesuit priest and a Jungian analyst. I said I would have never gone into my shadow, but what I learned about myself I found helpful, not only to myself, but those who I'm called to mentor. And in response, he smiled and said, no one willingly goes into their own shadow, Bob. They are pushed, but at least you've chosen to learn from the experience, and that is wonderful. So that's what Riding the Dragon is about. That's what my other work is about. Finding the keys, if any, to not merely surviving, but actually even potentially benefiting from the extremely challenging time we're going through, and what we want to do is make the most of it. I believe psychology is a gift from God and can help us, if we see it correctly. It's like a shovel used to plant a tree. Some people don't understand this gift, and they stand by idly with the shovel in their hand, praying to God to plant the tree. Use the shovel that you've been given. Others think that psychology is equal to spirituality and faith, and that's arrogant. It is merely a tool given to us, which we'll use in this presentation as a help. And so in this talk, I don't want to offer anything radically new, but instead I'd like to reframe what I feel is important for you to reflect upon with yourself and your friends. And secondly, highlight the challenges that can't be ignored. Ignoring them does no good. So let's look at this. It's not radical, but it's important for us to decide from this presentation what 3 or 4 things you want to take and pray over during this upcoming week. I want you to listen in a strange way to what I have to say. I want you to listen as if you haven't heard this information before. And I want you to have a sense of openness that has the key virtue of the desert at the heart of the openness. Now you might say to me, well, what is this virtue? Well, let me do it by way of story, because even if you want this virtue doesn't mean you're going to have it. A number of years ago, my daughter was sitting at the table at dinner time with my 2 granddaughters, and they were getting ready to get up, and she said, wait. She said, I have a question for you. And they're used to this stuff, because my daughter's a social worker, and so they see it as a game. And she said, well, what gifts has God given you, to freely share with others, during your lifetime? And they start launching in what gifts they had and this and that. And finally, when they come to the end of their lists, my son-in-law, who's sitting at the table, said, well, what about humility? And the youngest, who was about 4 or 5 at the time, said, well, what exactly is it? And he said, well, get the dictionary. She got the dictionary and he opened it up and he read the definition, and he said, well, now, who do you think of when I read that definition? And both my granddaughters and my daughter chime up, Mom, referring to my wife. And then he said, well, what about Pop? And they said, no, not Pop. So even if we want this gift, doesn't mean we're going to get it, but we need to focus on it, because humility is very important. Because when you take knowledge, which you all have, and add humility, you get wisdom. And when you take that very wisdom and add it to compassion, you get love. And love is at the heart of life, and God is love. So once again, you need to remember that this material I'm sharing, with you is not simply about you. One of the greatest gifts you can share with others is a sense of your own peace, your inner resilience, and a healthy perspective, but you can't share what you don't have. Being present to others is not easy at any time, but especially now with all that's going on and the needs that people have in your life. I remember a number of years ago, I was up at Harvard and I was sitting with Henry Nouwen in his little apartment, and we were chatting about a book I was planning to write, and I was titling it "Availability." The gift of relationship. And he looked at me, he said, "Oh, come on, he said, "You're more practical than that." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Availability is not just a gift, it's a challenge." And he said, "There must be something in scripture about this." And I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, I don't know, but it has to be there. So we chatted about the book and my life, for another 20 minutes. And all of a sudden he said, "I've got it. It's pruning." We learn from scripture that when you prune something, it doesn't blossom less, it blossoms more deeply. And I think we need to know that because we're in the middle of a spiritual and psychological winter solstice. We've been in the darkness. We remain in the darkness in many ways, but we can see the light. But in addition to all that we face, we need to recognize that we still have to remain compassionate and recognize that we're going to feel it at times. Uh, Jesus knew this, and we saw it in Mark 1:40 when he was approached by a leper who knelt before him and said, "If you wish, you could make me clean." And he said, "Well, I'll do it." And then he touched him and said, "Be made clean." And he became free of the leprosy. Please recognize that he touched him while he still had the leprosy, not after, and was made clean. When we're close to people who are suffering, we run the risk of not only catching their physical diseases, but also to be contaminated by their spiritual and psychological ones as well. And so, given this frequent lack of support, for persons like yourself who reach out to so many, I think it's important that we face the need to enhance resilience, improve self-care, and deepen your inner life. In enhancing personal resilience, I'd like you to become aware of what we call in my profession post-traumatic growth, PTG. It is the behavioral parallel to the spirituality of suffering, which occurs when we don't simply bounce back from stress, but paradoxically, because of it, become deeper as persons, both psychologically and spiritually, in ways that would not have been possible had the trauma or stress not occurred in the first place. But we have to do two things. One, we have to be honest about our stress. We need to honor it. You can't do spiritual romanticism. It doesn't work. Excuse me. But then we need to be open to where it can take us, because it may be able to take us in places that we could not have gone if we hadn't experienced the trauma or stress. Let me give you an illustration from my personal life. When my daughter was very small, she had severe scoliosis and needed a surgery to fuse 13 levels of her spine, and they put an iron bar up her back because, as you know, if you're in medicine or nursing, it takes bone forever to fuse. And then people think life is acute. It isn't. After the surgery, people would say, "Is she better? Is she better?" Well, and then later on in university, she had to have the rod taken out. And then when she was giving birth to a second daughter, she almost died, and on and on. Now she had a choice there. She was aware of all she was going through, but I finally realized she was open to where it could take her. When over breakfast one day, she said, "Dad, I always wanted, to be a Marine Corps officer like you were when you were young." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, but because of my situation, I can't." I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" She said, "I'm going to become a social worker and I'm going to work for the VA." And She does now, works with severely injured returning Iraqi and Afghani vets, among others. And one of them came in recently, she shared with me, that had a leg blown off. And she greeted him very, very warmly. And he said, "Boy, you're perky." And then she responded to him in a way that I couldn't, because I haven't been through what she'd been through. She looked him right in the eyes and said, "You've served our country well. Now you come on in and let us know what we can do for you." You see, in post-traumatic growth or the spirituality of suffering, the person has a chance to mature psychologically and spiritually in ways that many of us can't. They understand their signature strengths more clearly, particularly the shadow or minor ones. And as a result, they become more appreciative for life and the persons in it. Not being aware of serious stress in your life can be dangerous, particularly in its acute form. I was in Germany working with military chaplains just returning from war zones and just getting ready to give a talk on my book, Bounce, Living the Resilient Life. And a full bird colonel came up to see me and he said, "Before you give the talk, I just want to give you a caution." I said, "What's the caution?" He said, "There are a lot of ghosts in this room." I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "There's nothing left inside them." However, surprisingly, chronic secondary stress can be even more dangerous at times. We need to recognize that the seeds of compassion and the seeds of burnout, chronic secondary stress, are the same seeds. Physicians and nurses who took epidemiology courses years ago probably remember being taught that for every case of poisoning, there's at least a dozen cases of subclinical toxicity. Now, what does that mean when what we're speaking about today? It's the same case with secondary stress. All of us who care about others, should be concerned, not just extreme cases of severely impaired individuals. What you need to appreciate is for each one of you experiencing secondary stress in a severe form, there are at least a dozen cases on the edge of it. So that we need to recognize that the stress is always going to be there, particularly when we encounter change. Openness to change helps us to unlearn, as the disciples needed to do on the road to Emmaus. We can't avoid change if we wish our faith to be dynamic, our God to be dynamic, not static. Author Kathleen Norris, that I'm sure many of you have read, said about change, she said, "Disconnecting from change doesn't recapture the past, it loses the future." But again, it's not easy. The problem most often is that experiencing the stress of necessary change is a developmental process, not a cataclysmic event. It can creep up on us. Author and media theorist Marshall McLuhan once said, "If the temperature of the bath rises 1 degree every minute, how will the bather know when to scream?" We don't know when to scream today in Christianity, when all of the pressures keep building up. It's very easy for us to lose our way, even when we're seeking to be dedicated and committed individuals to what is good. So you don't get a break, you know? You might say, "Well, I'm really involved and maybe in religious life," or no. I was in South Africa working with people after the apartheid had ended. And I was giving a talk on perspective, which is another book. And a woman came up to me at the break and she said, "Do you have a moment?" I said, I do. She said, "Well, I just can't do it anymore." I said, "Well, what do you do?" She said, "Oh, I'm a social worker and I work with women who've been sexually and physically abused. And I try to get them justice. And for them to get justice, they have to go to the court. That means they have to take a day off from work. And many of them are poor, single parents. but they're so committed to the justice, they do it. And then we get to in front of the judge, who's often male, and give him the papers, and he looks and he says, "Oh, I haven't had a chance to read them. Make another appointment." She said, "I'm a failure." Well, I had to let the dust settle. She was pretty upset. And then finally I said, "Well, who was with that woman other than you at that moment?" And she said, "Well, no one." I said, "Would it be an exaggeration to say that you were closer to her at that moment other than anyone else in the world?" And she said, "No, it wouldn't be an exaggeration." And then in as gentle a voice as I could muster, I asked, "And you want to leave that?" I said, "Don't you realize in being compassionate Christians, we're not in the success business. We're in the faithfulness business." And I think that we need to be able to recognize and put failure in perspective. I was working with surgical residents, and I said to them, before we get into all this stuff on perspective, from the book I wrote for physicians and nurses, I said, what you need to recognize is during your tenure as a surgeon, or you're going to kill people. Maybe not by malpractice, but by mispractice, because you cannot be at an A level 100% of the time. And that's the same case with you, that you've got to recognize that you can't succeed all the time. And your call is to be faithful. We all deal with difficult situations. I remember speaking with a group with terrible morale once, and they didn't know who I was because I'm not famous, but I got in the room and you could cut the heat with a knife. And I thought, well, let me give it my best shot. And I gave it my best shot, nothing. And at the break, I went back to my room, and being very prayerful and having a big ego at the same time, I said, relieve me of this. I even went into some Old Testament laments like, smite them and their little children. In a sense, Jesus saying to me, I know where you got that, but we don't do that anymore. And then I sense a piece of scripture coming to the surface that I had read many times, but now I think I got it. And the piece was, they did terrible things to me and the prophets before me. They will do the same to you and worse at times. What you need to recognize is that I'm with you. I'm with you. So how do we know this? Well, I think one way we know it is something that you already do, and that's prayer in silence, solitude, and wrapped in gratitude. I think that is more essential than you'd realize. I was at Walter Reed Army Hospital speaking to physicians and nurses, and one of them come up to me at the break and said, "Do you got a minute?" I said, "I do." He said, "I'm just came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and all I'm doing is cutting people's legs off here at Walter Reed. I'm blowing my whole life through my rear end. Can you help me?" I said, "Well, can you be a bit more specific?" He said, "Well, the constant in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan," and he went through the list of what he experienced, and then what he experienced here. And then I finally said to him, "Well, what do you do at the end of your workday?" And he said, "Well, I go home." Now, see, he was angry at me. Happens all the time to me. And I said, "Well, you can't do that." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, those of us who work in the hospital, really, go through all kinds of things psychologically and spiritually. And, we get contaminated not only physically by what we encounter, but spiritually. And when you go to the bathroom, in a restaurant, it'll say over the sink, if you work here, you need to wash your hands before you go back to work. Well, those of us who work in the hospital know we need to wash our hands not only after we go to the bathroom, but before, so we don't contaminate ourselves and other people. What's happening is you're getting contaminated, and then you go home and contaminate your family. I said, well, what do I do about it? Is it a big deal? I said, no, it's not a big deal. I said, you need to simply take out some time. So walk through the hospital at the end of your tour. Let it settle. If that's no good because they'll yell, Doc, Doc, then get into your car and sit in silence, solitude, and wrapped in gratitude. And let the geography of the day come to the surface. The objective geography, what happened? And then the subjective geography, how you felt about it, what you thought about it. Because often what we feel and think is erroneous. We expect too much of ourselves. We expect not to fail and always succeed. And I said, if you do that, it can make a difference. Now, you may be sitting there and thinking, yeah, he needed to psychologically and spiritually lean back at the end of the day to decontaminate himself. I know that. I believe in prayer. Well, you don't get off easy. When I was in Cambodia, at the end of a talk, a Buddhist nun came up to see me and she said, Doctor, do you have a moment? I said, I do. Yeah. What can I do for you, sister? She said, we have a young Buddhist who's chaplain at the hospital in the unit for farmers who've had their legs blown off by landmines, and he's getting very depressed. What do I do? I said, well, sister, after he's done with work and he goes down to his car and he sits there and meditates before going back to the temple, what comes up in his meditation that would help me give you a more intelligent response? She stopped and looked at me, with her eyes like that, like a deer caught in the headlights. And she said, I am so embarrassed, doctor. I said, what are you embarrassed about? She said, I am a Buddhist nun, and I never thought about meditation. And when we think about meditation, it's how we meditate. It's how we sit there in silence, solitude, and wrapped in gratitude before God. I was in a seminary and sitting with the rector, and the rector said, I wanted to ask you about one of our seminarians. He's really difficult, and I said, well, does he take out time for meditation? Oh, he said he's in front of the Blessed Sacrament for a full hour, and then he comes out and he talks about the other seminarians and the faculty in very nasty ways. Well, it's very obvious that he's going into chapel and not sitting in solitude with God and listening to God. Instead, it's solitude with his big ego and listening to his big ego. When we sit in silence and solitude before God, we need to be careful of particularly three dead ends. One is arrogance, where we project the blame on others. Well, it's fun to give away the blame, but you also give away the power. Second is ignorance, where you condemn yourself. People think that's reality. That's being really good. God doesn't condemn you, and you're not bigger than God. And third is discouragement, because we want things in chronos, our time, not kairos, God's time. So the spirit we need is a spirit of intrigue, where we open ourselves. When we do this, it not only helps spiritually, but we increase our emotional intelligence, because we can look at our dysfunctional thinking. We can see how it may impact our emotions and actions, and we can reflect on how we can control, handle, and express our emotions in our interactions. It's when we don't do that, it causes pain. Regular reflective periods help us see what triggers emotional pain and causes moral injury in your work. In reflective periods, we also can better discover what and who provide us with psychological safety and a healthy community. Our perspective is key. In the Talmud, it's written, when you do not see things as they are, you see things as you are. In our own Matthew 6:22, if your eye is good, your whole body will be good. Buddhists speak about it as the unobstructed visions, and Hindus refer to it in the Upanishads as a turning around in one's seat of consciousness, This sense of perspective is very, very important. You know, when we have the right perspective, we see life differently. We experience life differently. The Jamaican singer, musician, and songwriter Bob Marley said, "Some people feel the rain, others just get wet." With a healthy perspective that arises out of mentoring ourselves and receiving mentoring from others, we're able to frame life differently. The Maori have a word for autism. It is takiwatanga. And what that means is in their own time and space. What a lovely way to view autism. So, where do we begin? I think 4 questions and a special guidance from Jesus. The 4 questions are: what aspects of your personal life, work, and relationships are most challenging and stressful for you? It's different for each of us. Second, what habits and routines should you keep, and which do you need to replace given the changes you have to deal with in your ministry, work, or personal life? Third, what approaches to dealing with increased pressures have you found most helpful? You know, there's a lot of wisdom in those of you listening to me, so share it with each other. Well, you say, well, what's been helpful for you? And finally, how can you improve the ways in which you approach your personal and professional life? You know, I think the words of Jesus helps in this regard. It's Matthew 22:34-40. And Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And like a good rabbi, he does 2 things. First, he puts people at ease. And once they're at ease, he pulls out the rug from under them to wake them up. And the second thing he does is he selects from Torah. And the pieces he selects are from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And the first thing he does is select one of the 613 precepts of the Pharisees of the day, a heavy precept, and he holds it up high. And he says, you must love God with your whole heart and your whole mind and your whole soul. And you could just image the Jews nodding their heads. How could you disagree with that? But then he reaches down and takes a light precept and holds it up on the same level as the heavy precept. And he says, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. So what he's doing is he's sharing with us what we need to balance. Presence to others, because I don't think you can experience true joy and peace, without sharing with others, expecting nothing in return. It's a circle of grace. And second, presence to self through self-care, self-knowledge, and self-love, because you can't share what you don't have. And finally, presence to God, because God is that center in our life. Presence to others is simply offering some space and respect. A little girl was late coming home from school one day, and her mother said, "Where were you?" I was worried. She said, "Oh, I was helping a classmate who was in trouble." She said, "Well, what did you do for her?" She said, "I sat down next to her and helped her cry." Respect is the next. I had a patient that was sexually abused as a child, and I was seeing her as an adult. We were coming to the end of the treatment. And, I stopped her and I said, picture my face as a mirror. What do you see? And she said, "Oh, I see a woman alive with the spirit, a woman who's able to resurrect that little child that was lost because of the abuse and integrate her again with the woman she is now. And because of it, she's hot stuff." I said, "Well, you weren't this way when you first came in to see me. How did you get to this place?" And I thought she was going to tell me techniques. And she said, "Oh, you mean you don't know?" And I said, "No." She said, "Oh, it was simple." I said, "Simple?" She said, "Yeah. The first time I came in here to see you, I simply watched how you sat with me, and then I began sitting with myself in the same way." You see, when we have this balance between offering to others taking care of ourselves and being present to God, then we recognize that it's not the amount of darkness in the world, the church, our family, country, or even in ourselves that matters. In the end, it's how we stand in that darkness. A perspective that once again is centering on integrating autonomy, our will, and theonomy, God's will. Well, I've packed in a lot of stuff, so maybe we can now take a few moments to have some questions or comments, and then I'll quickly wrap it up and we can get out on time.
Thank you so much, Bob. I invite any of you or all of you to submit a question or a comment. Thank you so much. You're right. You did pack in a lot of information there, but so valuable, so meaningful. And as you were talking, I was trying to think, okay, what are the two or three things, right, that I need to take from this? And so I hope everyone else did also. I do have a question here. Someone has asked about, you were talking about meditation, and you used a phrase, silence.
Solitude and wrapped in gratitude.
Okay. Silence, solitude, and wrapped in gratitude. Okay.
Yeah, the
That's
gratitude is especially important because people think that happiness leads to gratitude. It's the opposite. Gratitude leads to happiness. But I think if we're really compassionate people, that we forget to be grateful. I remember Thich Nhat Hanh during the Vietnam War said, we were so busy helping the wounded that we forgot that in Vietnam, particularly at night in the forest, you can smell the scent of mint, coriander, sage, and thyme. And I was in Vietnam, in Hanoi, I guess about 10 years ago, to work with helpers and healers. And I was in this boat going up a lagoon, and I could smell those scents he was talking about. I think what Thich Nhat Hanh was pointing to is the same thing that Brother David Stendhal Rast wrote in his book Gratefulness. He said the problem with us is we leave the house each day with a list, and on that list is what we'll be grateful for. He said throw away the list and be open. And I think that's what morning prayer does. It sets the tone and opens us to see all the wonders that are around us. Could be a cup of coffee. All of a sudden we can experience God. People say, oh, I wish God would appear to me. Well, God does appear to you in so many ways, and in dramatic ways. I remember a priest telling me that they were building a new church and they were putting up the crucifix for the first time, and people in the construction workers spontaneously took their hard hats off as a sign of respect. But it can be snow falling on snow. It could be the rain on your roof. It could be children laughing or an older person smiling at you because you helped them with something. These experiences are around us, but we have to be open, and that's what gratefulness does.
mm-hmm. Thank you. You started talking about prayer, and we have a question here about prayer. How do we ensure that we're hearing God, not ourselves, in prayer?
I think that this is uh, requires us to have a willingness to share with God everything, not to sugarcoat things. We walk in church and we lower our voices, right? It's the same way in prayer. We often lower our voices with God. We need to clearly say what happened to God. We need to clearly say, how did I feel about it? I was angry. They have nerve to, and then allow it to go a step further. Leave it, see what the feelings are, explore them with God. So there has to be a trust. There was once a spiritual writer that said he thought we should replace the word faith in the gospel with the word trust. Because it's the amount of trust we have in God that makes a difference. Also, talking with with people that we believe in, that we respect. Uh, I, you have to be careful about that, though, because I've watched this in communities, whether it's priests or nuns or lay people, that they often, pick these people, and they're happy in this boat together, but the boat is going in the wrong direction. It's systemic compartmentalization, where we put to the side and cover something that is unpleasant, make excuses for it. So honesty, and a willingness to share, with somebody who would guide us, that's very important.
Mhm. Thank you. What suggestions do you have for us in dealing with people who are having difficulty dealing with their traumas and stressors?
Hmm. Well, first of all, you have to have great patience. I even see it in therapists, where they become impatient with somebody who has gone through a trauma. Trauma takes long to heal. As a matter of fact, even in a loss of someone, a death, you know, I remember a patient coming in to see me and saying, excuse me, I'm seeing you because, people say I'm not getting over my husband's death. I said, well, how long ago did he die? She said, a year. And I said, what kind of a relationship was it? Oh, she said it was wonderful. But they just, they keep saying, well, you got too many pictures around, or this and that. I said, well, you take as long as you need. Really? I said, yeah, because the reality is, you take as long as you need to recognize that God, rather, that your husband is going to take a place in your life. He's never really going to leave. You're different in many ways because of your relationship. And she came back the next session and she said, well, I only kept one photo up. I said, well, what made you take all those down? They sounded like that. Oh, she said, because I didn't need them. He was here.
Mm.
And it's so patience, first of all, with people who've been traumatic. Second, don't want success. I mean, I think we want them to get better. And then what we do in wanting them to get better, we give them the message that they're failing. Well, if you've been through a lot and now somebody's telling you you're failing, instead, that whole sense of, yes, yes, this was terrible, this was awful, and but I'm not getting on. Well, don't have such great expectations. Honor what you've been through, but then be open, as you want to be, to where it might take you. Because after what you've been through, you could deal with people in a way that's so much kinder and gentler and understanding than I ever could. So it's that space. Give people some space.
Mhm. Wonderful. Any thoughts on the continual negativity of media presence in our culture and its effect on our spiritual life?
Yeah, that's a good question because, well, first of all, they get paid to be negative. I mean, when people tune into TV and they get online, they expect to see something dramatic, negative, and so it's almost like, they can find a cloud and a silver lining in expert way. So I expect it. So first, expect it. Second, I like to be aware, so I don't say, well, I'm going to shut it all off. Instead, what I do in the morning, I'll watch most of the shows, particularly CBS News has 90 seconds. It's a summarization. I don't need to see them beat it to death then after that. So then I also begin to recall the positive things in life. It begin to recognize so much good is going on that I key into that. And I don't key into it as something shiny, something like, romantic, or, excuse me, you'll see channels say now a minute of good news. Well, so I see it in the people's faces, and I see people working in homes for the elderly. I see it in the hospital. I see it in the parish. I see it in schools. I see it in the streets where people are helping those who are homeless. Um, So I also am very tuned in to a balanced kind of thing. So I expect the negativity, I limit my exposure, and I, ventilate by myself. I could see my neighbors looking through the window saying he really should increase his meds 5 milligrams. But I'll ventilate about something like, why don't we have better gun control laws? That kind of thing. But I'm also aware of the need for peace in me, not for myself, but if I'm wasting energy on negativity, then the self is limited. I won't have my arms open for you. And you deserve better. You deserve that they're open for you.
Hmm. Yes. Somebody asked here, I liked your term post-traumatic growth. I have to agree with that. Can you elaborate more? Are we supposed to use prayer, isolation, and gratitude to achieve this growth?
No, it comes. Those are steps. So first of all, but the first important part of is to honor what you're going through. That's people right away say, well, I should be more grateful, or we're all not so grateful. So don't say that. Or people have it worse than me. Yes, they do, but you are going through this. So I encourage people to talk about it, honor it. But then the next step is to be open to where it can take you. Now, where it can take you really can also depend upon your willingness to honor the pains of others. When you work in the hospital, you can see all the pain. When you see the pain in the Ukraine and in parts of Africa, you can see it, and that helps you lean back and gain perspective. So it's honoring your own pain, being open to where it might take you, being grateful. Being grateful is not simply a guilt exercise. Oh, I should be more grateful. It's having your eyes open to all the gifts that God has given you that you might miss if you didn't pay attention. So, a cup of coffee, may not seem like much, but if you've been in places where you can't get a cup, even something simple like that makes a difference. The fact of being able to email somebody or text somebody or call somebody, when during COVID, people misunderstood you needed to be physically distant, but not emotionally.
Mhm.
So the gratitude of having a circle of friends, maybe a complete one. By that I mean, because there's the Cameroonian proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So you need the prophet that says what voices are guiding you. You need the cheerleader that reflects the loving face of God. You need the harasser or teaser, because on the way to taking God and ministry and compassion seriously, we often do a detour and take ourselves too seriously. And finally, we need the inspirational friend that calls us to be all that we can be without embarrassing us, so that we are where we are. So that kind of thing can really open us up. And naturally, because this is Ave Maria Press, good reading helps too. Is that good?
That was good. That was good. Ah, so honor, I hear honor, openness, and gratitude.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm going to conclude this part of our webinar with this comment from one of our attendees here. This was so relevant to my life right now. There are a lot of changes happening in many parts of our lives. How we go about dealing with it will determine what type of life we have. I appreciated this webinar. Thank you.
Great.
Yes. Bob, you wanted to conclude with a couple of.
Yeah, just a couple comments.
Mhm.
Um, at the 10th session of psychotherapy or mentoring, what happens by then is that for me, I get a chance to see all the negativities on the table: the angers, the fears, the sense of being misunderstood, the guilt, the shame. And as I look into the eyes of the person sitting in front of me, I think, if only you could also see how good you are, what a gentle presence you've been in this world for so many. And my hope is that they will be able to regain a healthy perspective and see themselves through the loving eyes of God. And that's my hope for those who are here with me. If you haven't been in darkness recently and you're not in darkness now, you will be at some point, because darkness comes and goes for everybody who cares. And you may read good psychology, and you should, you know. It's like that shovel I spoke about. But the darkness may not lift as fast as you'd like. You may get on your knees and pray, and the darkness still might not lift as fast as you'd like. Well, I promise you no less darkness and no quicker lifting, but I promise you this: if you're present to that darkness by being present to others and being compassionate, if you're present to that darkness by seeking to understand yourself in new ways and see how you can take care of yourself in new ways and honor yourself, and if you're present to that darkness by being more faithful to prayer, you will be different for the rest of your life. You might say, well, why do you say that? Well, when you're totally present to darkness, you experience humility. And as I shared with you at the beginning, when you take knowledge, which you have, and add humility, you get wisdom. And when you add that to compassion, you get love, and God is love. Life is chronic, but suffering need not be the last word. And I think that two comments by US presidents might help. John F. Kennedy said, one person can make a difference, and every person should try. I believe that. And so we need to do whatever we can to have the stamina that comes from having a healthy perspective. And the second president is Clinton. President Clinton traveled to Derry in Northern Ireland to deliver the eulogy for Martin McGuinness at St. Columba's Church. And during the presentation, he shared a phone conversation he had with Nelson Mandela after he had become president of the United States. And Mandela called and said he was getting so much criticism. And Clinton said, oh, from the Afrikaners? He said, no, from my own people. They think I've sold them out. And then Clinton asked him, well, what do you tell them? And in reply, Mandela told Clinton that he responded to them by saying, yes, and I spent 27 years in jail. 27 years. They took the best years of my life away. I didn't see my children grow up. It ruined my marriage, and a lot of my friends were killed. And if I can get over it, you can too. We've got to build a future. Yes, all of us, like Nelson Mandela, must be faithful and seek to build a future for ourselves and others in the spirit of the gospel, in response to our call from God. Each of us has a unique call that will change at each stage of our lives. Each of us must find it, nourish it, and share it in only ways that we can. If we do, we might better understand, possibly for the first time, what the author Henry James meant when he wrote, live all you can. It's a mistake not to. It doesn't so matter what you do in particular, so long as you've had your life. If you haven't had that, what have you had? That is Imago Dei, living fully in the image that we have been called to live in, and then to share it fully. We're in tough times now, but these are also opportune times to deepen in ways that would not have been possible had we not gone through what we're going through at this point. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been very inspiring, very enlightening, great wisdom that you have shared with us. We are so grateful. And somebody asked, is all of this in the book?
No, no, unfortunately, it's not. But it is. I must say that I didn't realize how much I like writing until a friend of mine said, "How many books have you published?" And when I told him, he said, "Bob, I think you need to get out more often." Yep. But I would say Riding the Dragon is a good place to begin, and then Everyday Simplicity on Prayer, that also is published by Ave, would be a good support. And a little book that I did called The Simple Care of a Hopeful Heart for Oxford University Press. The reason I mention those three is they're all paperbacks. They're down to earth, and I've gotten good feedback on them.
Mhm.
So that might be a suggestion.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we know that Riding the Dragon has made such a positive impact on people's lives. And so this is our 20th anniversary edition. Can you believe that, Bob?
I had hair then when it came out. I did.
Oh, so we want to offer this to all of you with a 25% discount using code webinar 0124 for today's date when ordering at avemariapress.com. Thank you so much, Bob. And if you don't know all this, Bob will be speaking at the LA Religious Education Congress this coming February. So hopefully you'll be, perhaps you'll be joining and you can see his talk or hear his talk there. Thank you once again. Thank you, everybody, for sharing this hour with us. We greatly appreciate it. And we invite you to join us. February 7th will be our next webinar. Paul George will talk about awakening the masculine soul and how we can involve or engage men in parish life today in our church. So we hope you can join us for that. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care. Thanks again, Bob. Bye-bye.